Hello there, and welcome to Cowboy Hour with Alex. Yeehaw! I asked my patrons which precon they wanted me to look at from Outlaws at Thunder Junction, and a plurality wanted to see Grand Larceny. So in this video, I'm going to look at that precon, and I'm going to ask 3 questions. What is the deck trying to do? How well is it doing that? And how could it be improved to better accomplish that task? With that framework set up, let's talk about the commander. Here we have Gonti, Canny Inquisitor. Gonti reduces the cost of your stolen spells, and thieves the top card of an opponent's library whenever you get through combat damage on them. My first thought when I saw this is that this card is almost identical to another Commander set card that saw a reprint last year, in both effect and power level. Ramirez de Pietro, Pillager. They both exile opposing cards to play whenever opponents are hit. They both go away to pay for part of the cost of the stolen cards, and for an extra mana and an extra color, Gonti has the benefits of not being restricted to pirates, being able to play opposing lands, and being able to spend mana of any type on stolen spells. Luckily, I actually quite enjoy this design. I find the design of stealing cards as a result of hitting multiple opponents to be fun and encouraging of dynamic gameplay. Theft as a general archetype is fun in that it scales to table power level, but where some theft decks go wrong is in making theft the whole game plan, and having absolutely no plan for winning outside of yoinking opposing bombs. This will be okay against opposing mid-range decks some of the time, but it will struggle if you get unlucky or if you're facing off against decks that are more synergistic, which win through cards working well together rather than powerful individual cards. I like the design of Gonti and Ramirez because conditioning a deck's theft on it dealing combat damage to one or more players is kind of like bumpers on the sides of a bowling alley. It prevents deck builders from making the classic blunder of forgetting a win plan, since the cards needed to do the theft, creatures that aren't being blocked, are also a thing that will win games. With that out of the way, let's talk about Gonti in particular. I'd classify Gonti as a soft payoff. A payoff that is pretty easy to get some value off of, but which scales only modestly with additional inputs. The amount of cards stolen per turn by Gonti caps at 3, and a 1 mana discount on stolen spells is also pretty modest for a 5 mana commander, meaning that we'll likely be falling behind if we aren't maxing out the advantage we can from Gonti starting reasonably early in the game. For this reason, I expect some amount of a Gonti deck to be made up of evasive creatures that can get down to thieving not long after Gonti has hit the board. It doesn't need to be a whole ton. 1 trigger for each opponent means we're not playing Edric or anything, but if we're not getting 3 triggers per turn a decent amount of the time, we're leaving advantage on the table. Another possible choice with Gonti would be running additional cards that steal, but running too many of these effects might be a bit of a trap. We only have so much mana to spend on opposing cards. So these are going to be the immediate 2 things I look at. A decent amount of evasive creatures for getting Gonti triggers, and maybe a modest amount of other cards that steal. Looking at the creature base of the deck, we do see 18 creatures with flying or another form of hard evasion. There are also a number of cards that encourage dealing combat damage to a player, a category which obviously includes the commander as well. As a result, this deck has a decently potent evasive creatures game plan, which it can use to generate value off the commander and other cards. As expected, we can also see a small suite of cards in the 99 that can steal cards and reduce the cost of stolen cards, and these will naturally lead the deck into a late game plan of playing lots of opposing cards, using theft in tandem with its evasive creatures to bring the deck to victory. So that seems to be the plan. But how's the deck doing with this game plan? I'll start with what I like here. One of my biggest criticisms of the Blame Game precon was that the mana base was quite bad. Wizards, please. Just put things that tap for colored mana in your precons. Just do it. I know you can. Thank you. So, did my pleading to Wizards of the Coast lead to any improvement? Well, this deck's mana base is honestly pretty good. The colorless utility lands are capped at 2, and the deck runs sets of temples, pain lands, check lands, and bad filters, as well as a spattering of other duels, including 2 good filtering lands. Wizards of the Coast seems to have made the choice to give this precon a $30 mana base, rather than give 1 or 2 powerful cards to justify the precon price, and I honestly fully support this. New players need good lands a lot more than they need a trouble in pairs. Now that said, there are places to improve with this mana base. I'm going to be talking about one improvement a bit later in this video, and I have a whole video on building a mana base that's in the pipeline, but the overall message I'm trying to get across here is that this mana base is pretty good, and you can pick up and play with this deck without worrying too much about getting color screwed or mana screwed. Another thing I like is that this deck has a decent amount of removal. The deck has 2 creatures that bonk stuff when they hit players, a couple board wipes, and a handful of pieces of targeted removal. It's also running a couple counterspells, though both are playing into the theft vibe here and end up being a bit subpar as a result, for reasons I'll talk about a bit later. In addition to this, the deck's ramp suite and value engines are decent enough, which should allow the deck to keep on chugging into the late game and not run out of steam. The deck's ramp, draw, and interaction will also be supplemented by cards stolen from opponents, though I support the choice to have a decent amount in to start with in these categories so that we're not relying too much on opponents in order to play the game. Okay, so that's the stuff I like. With that out of the way, what do I dislike about this precon? So this deck reminds me a lot of older precons in terms of the cohesiveness of its vision, or lack thereof. There are two different game plans here, evasive creature beatdown and theft, and actually my first impression when looking at this deck is that they might play decently well together. The commander is clearly trying to act as a point of fusion here, and there are a number of creatures that play well into both the evasive creature plan and the theft plan. So what's the problem? Well, there are a few issues at play here. One is that the deck isn't running enough evasive creatures, and the ones it does have cost too much mana on average. I'd say the deck almost always wants to have one or more evasive creatures in play by the time it gets its commander out, but the list only contains 12 evasive creatures below 5 mana, which isn't a very reliable count for getting such a pivotal type of card. The deck could be looking to develop some 5 to 7 mana beaters and play the commander a bit later, but this requires more ramp than the deck is currently running, and also doesn't utilize the commander as well. Overall, the current suite of evasive creatures just doesn't work for me. This deck wants 3 Gonti triggers a turn, and that's just not going to be consistently fulfilled by this selection. Another issue is that there are lots of cards that do some sort of stealing-oriented thing, but don't require paying mana to cast the cards. This might seem normal at first blush, but there's actually basically no mechanical connection between these cards and the theft theme as a whole. They're identical to a random mid-range beater as far as cohesion and synergy are concerned. This is not to say that these cards are all bad or not worth running. Thieving Skydiver is a lovely card, Dazzling Sphinx is a solid evasive creature, and the Ninjas are fun payoff for evasive creatures. What it is to say, though, is that this deck is effectively spending some number of card slots on flavor, which isn't an objectively wrong choice, but for a mass market, playable out-of-the-box product, it's certainly a choice. I ran 30 playtests with the deck, and overall it had some good curve-outs, usually either landing quality 2 and 3 drops into the commander, or ramping into one of the deck's bigger threats. But it also had a lot of not great curve-outs. In 15 of the 30 games, the deck failed to curve out in a way that would allow it to meaningfully launch into a game plan by turn 5 to 6. This failure can manifest a number of different ways, but the most common ones were failing to spend its mana on turns 2 to 4, playing out cards that weren't impactful, having disjointed card types, and failing to gain enough mana to accomplish the tasks that the deck's draws might allow for. The deck did occasionally miss land drops and have awkward color situations, though this definitely wasn't one of the more pressing issues, and it's also likely fixable with a bit more early filtering. Overall, I can definitely see this deck feeling pretty great with certain sets of draws, but a lot of rollouts with this deck are kinda disjointed and awkward. So, what could this deck do to improve? First of all, I want to talk about some cards I just generally dislike. Cunning Rhetoric is a mixture of a defense card and a theft card, but it doesn't actually accomplish either task. Your opponents can choose not to send small-scale attacks your way to prevent you from getting value, but when they do want to attack you, the downside of getting a single card exiled for up to a full board of creatures attacking is just not a deterring factor in the slightest. Next up, Void Attendant. I get the vision, and I love the idea of repurposing a forgotten uncommon from 2015, but the card just isn't that useful here. This deck can't do much with tokens, it has enough draw to not need a mana sink, and doesn't have enough instant speed plays to make it useful as a mana banking option. Another card I dislike is Mimeoplasm. This deck has no mill of any kind, and one singular card that causes you to discard, making our boy Plasm a pretty dead draw before the late game. Yet another card I hate here is Stolen Goods. The average non-land card in an EDH deck is like 3.5 mana, so you're getting less value than the amount of mana you paid, and what you get will likely be unrelated to what you're trying to do at any given moment. Next up, redundant cards. I strongly dislike Predator's Hour. It does the same thing as the Command Zone, but without any real upside other than a possible tokens plan. I like Dream Thief's Bandana a bit better, but it still compares very unfavorably to a similar equipment such as Mask of Memory or Mask of Riddles. Running either of these cards when the deck doesn't even have enough evasive creatures to consistently get its Gonti triggers each turn feels wrong on a pretty fundamental level. It's at this point I should jump back to the two counterspells I mentioned earlier. Both cost a lot of mana, and high-cost counterspells with added bonuses do work, but mostly only in draw-go-style control decks. This is because these decks will often run spells that further their game plan at instant speed, most often card draw, and this allows them to counter a thing if they need to, but still have a way to spend that mana on the end step before their turn if they don't end up countering anything. By contrast, this deck runs very little at instant speed, meaning that if it holds up 4 or 5 mana for a counterspell, that's just wasted mana if the counterspell doesn't get used, and this will often incentivize players to counter something largely irrelevant in order to not waste the mana. Plasm Capture is also very symbol dense, so I'd cut it for a lower cost counterspell like Negate. Smirking Spelljacker will stay in for now, despite my misgivings about its mana cost, and this is because it's also a 3/3 creature with flying, which means that countering something largely irrelevant is still a mostly acceptable outcome. With those initial cuts out of the way, I think there are two possible paths forward for this deck, and those two paths are play more into the big theft stuff by adding more ramp, or play more into the combat damage element by adding evasive creatures and evasion. Basically, take the two things the deck is doing and make it focus more on one of those. I'm choosing the second one, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, I don't think Gonti should be thought of as a pure theft commander. The requirement of hitting opponents is already pushing the deck in a somewhat aggressive direction, and spending too much deck space on other theft cards and theft payoffs worsens the deck's ability to get in for combat damage and get Gonti triggers. The other reason is that this deck's alternative commander, Felix 5 Boots, is a fun card that is clearly pushing for a more combat damage oriented version of things, so I chose to take cues from that as well. I justify this here because I personally would choose to cut quite a lot of cards that fit into the theft theme, and I could see that being a contentious choice. Doc Orlok? Just reducing the cost of stolen cards isn't good enough. Oblivion's Hour? Doesn't do enough. Villainous Wealth? This deck isn't really a ramp deck, and playing Villainous Wealth with a mana spend of less than 10 won't be worth it most of the time. Chaos Wand? Also funny, and also not good enough outside of a big mana deck. Extract Brain is similarly awkward outside of a ramp deck, because the ideal hit is a big bomb, but you'll be battling against time to play it with a big enough X before your opponent is able to play the hypothetical threat, and you also might end up targeting a player only to find nothing impactful in their hand. What am I bringing in for these cards? The most notable type of card I'm adding is what I'll call evasive utility beaters, creatures that are low cost and have both some sort of evasion and some sort of benefit that smooths out the deck's game plan. The first three of these I'm adding are Malcolm Alluring Scoundrel, Looter Ilkor, and Suspicious Stowaway. The package here is great, 2-mana evasive creatures that also offer looting on hit, and these will help smooth out draws and filter away unneeded cards. Siren Stormtamer is another solid add, offering a bit of protection in addition to being an evasive creature. Thousand-Faced Shadow is another utility 1-drop, and this has the benefit of allowing us to slip through something like a Silent Blade Oni on a crowded board, since the token is unblockable due to being created after the Declare Blockers phase. I'm also adding a couple 3-4 cost utility beaters, with one of these being Drana, Liberator of Malakir. This card is going to help with the beatdown game plan, and the fact that it buffs everything else before combat damage is a nice touch. Rankle, Master of Pranks, is another utility beater that can offer a wide range of use cases depending on what the deck needs or what would set back opponents. My final utility beater add is Kellen, Inquisitive Prodigy, a card that also adds a bit of ramp to the deck. I don't think this deck needs a lot of ramp, but I think a gentle increase to the amount of ramp isn't a bad idea either. Another addition I opted for is Wayward Swordtooth, a solid beater that allows for extra land plays. I like the extra land plays in theft decks because they allow the deck to ramp using opposing lands. I also added Mask of Riddles and swapped out Darksteel Ingot for Sonic Screwdriver to increase the amount of evasion in the deck, as being able to swing something like a Fallen Shinobi or a Silent Blade Oni through a crowded board is quite nice. From there, my other non-land additions were a couple counterspells and a removal spell, just to give this deck a bit more ability to deal with concerning things opponents are doing. The deck wasn't doing terrible on this, but it has the deck space for a bit more interaction due to the value it has in the command zone, so I'm going to give it that interaction. Now, onto the mana base. As I said, this deck's mana base is pretty good, with the biggest issue I note being that its check lands don't have as much support as I'd prefer. As a quick fix to this, I choose to swap out the temples for Dominaria United typed lands. Ideally, an incremental change for the deck would be to swap these out for Karlov Manor duels, but those are going for upwards of $5 a piece at the moment, so they can wait if you're not trying to spend too much extra. I also wish that Wizards would print enemy cycles of Tango and Cycle lands, as it'd be nice to have a bit of upside to sweeten the deal of cutting temples. The other change I made to the mana base was swapping out a swamp and a forest for 2 more islands, since we added several more cheap creatures in blue. I could delve a lot deeper into building a 3-color mana base, but I won't be doing that in this video due to the aforementioned acceptableness of this deck's mana base. Alright, those are my improvements. Overall, I like this precon okay. If I was to be charitable, I'd say that it was probably built with the intent of allowing modification paths for both a zanier full theft build and for the path I chose of emphasizing combat damage and evasive creatures. If I was to be uncharitable, I'd say that evasive creatures is the only build of this deck that actually works with Gonti, and that all of the unsynergistic goofy theft stuff is at best an obstacle to throw newer players off the path of making the deck actually decent, because who's going to cut a Chaos Wand or a Villainous Wealth when those cards are so fun? Whatever the case may be, this precon reminds me a lot of older ones in its lack of focus, though its decent card quality and solidly built mana base will certainly lead to it performing better than most of those. Thanks for watching, and as always a big thanks to my patrons who allow making YouTube videos to be my full-time job. That's pretty cool. You can also let me know in the comments if you liked this, or if you agree with my analysis of the deck. I tried to go a bit more in depth on the improvements, as I kind of blazed through them with Blame Game.